The true storm that swallowed Eliezer whole did not rage upon the surface of the Sea of Galilee that morning. It was churning in the pit of his stomach. Eliezer was a fisherman of 30 years, his hands corded like old rope, his face permanently etched with the brine and sun of the Kinneret. Yet lately the sea had become his mortal enemy, mocking him with its bounty for others while yielding nothing but frayed nets and impossible debt for him. For weeks the weight of his failures, a promised dowry he could not deliver, a loan shark breathing down his neck in Capernaum, the shame of watching his younger brother succeed where he had withered, had compressed his spirit into a dark, brittle stone. He felt lost not in a geographical sense, but in the deepest meaning of existence. The path he had walked since childhood, the path of the sea, had vanished beneath him. He was adrift in despair, paralyzed by the feeling that even if he exerted every last measure of his strength, the outcome was guaranteed failure. That morning, the lake was a sheet of glass, deceptively tranquil, reflecting the blazing late-afternoon sun like polished brass, but Eliezer knew the calm was a lie. He had agreed reluctantly to transport a small, odd group of travelers across the breadth of the lake toward the eastern shore, a short journey that promised only meager coin, but he needed the pence desperately, enough to buy thin bread for his family that night. As he watched the passengers board, his eyes were immediately drawn to the central figure, a man known only as Jesus, the teacher from Nazareth. Eliezer had seen crowds drawn to this man before, watched them cling to his every word on the shore, but he had dismissed it all as fleeting popular fervor, the typical madness that occasionally swept through Galilee. What struck Eliezer now, as the teacher stepped into the vessel, was the unsettling, almost arrogant composure that radiated from him. There was no hustle, no concern over the narrow space, only a deep, abiding stillness that seemed entirely out of place in a world governed by rushing water and shifting sands. Eliezer resented this peace. He resented anyone who seemed unburdened, for he knew the price of true existence was constant struggle and gnawing anxiety. As they pushed off from the shore, the setting sun cast long orange shadows across the water. Eliezer gripped the tiller, his knuckles white, focusing solely on the mechanics of the journey, trying to drown out the loud, hopeful chatter of the disciples huddled near the bow. He wished for silence, or better yet, he wished the whole boat would simply dissolve into the deep blue, taking him and his crushing burden away forever. He had reached the terrifying point where death felt like the only form of true rest available. The journey began normally enough. An hour of slow, arduous rowing against a barely perceptible current. Eliezer, lost in the rhythm of his despair, barely registered the faces of the 12 men crowding the small fishing boat, though he recognized several of the local fishermen: Peter, always loud and boisterous, Andrew, his cautious brother, and the zealot Simon. These men had given up steady incomes, given up their very nets, to follow this itinerant rabbi, a choice Eliezer viewed as the height of recklessness, bordering on madness. Their enthusiasm grated on his nerves. They spoke of kingdoms and miracles, of seeds and harvest, while Eliezer was obsessed only with the here and now, the unforgiving ledger of his debts, and the aching hunger in his family's eyes. He noticed, however, that the teacher had almost immediately sought rest. Once settled in the stern, using one of the sparse leather cushions reserved for wealthy passengers or the boat's owner, a cushion Eleazar grudgingly provided, Jesus had fallen instantly and profoundly asleep. This deep slumber, this instant surrender to rest, fascinated and irritated Eleazar in equal measure. How could a man who claimed to carry the hopes of Israel, who attracted such vast, demanding crowds, simply switch off the weight of the world? Eleazar himself hadn't known true deep sleep in months. Every night was a restless sequence of panicked awakenings, fueled by the calculating gaze of the loan shark. The hours passed. The sun finally dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson and violet, a beautiful yet unsettling backdrop. The air grew heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes great violence. Eleazar, guided by the instinct born of a lifetime on the water, felt a prickle of unease. The Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, was notorious for its sudden, unpredictable squalls. Surrounded by high hills, the cold air rushing down the ravines often collided violently with the warm air trapped over the water, generating winds that could materialize out of nowhere, transforming the placid lake into a swirling, lethal vortex in mere minutes. He glanced repeatedly at the southern horizon, where a specific, dense, oily blackness was beginning to bloom beneath the twilight colors, the hallmark of a truly dangerous change. He muttered a warning to the disciples nearest him, advising them to secure the loose ropes and prepare to furl the small sail. But his warnings were met with light-hearted dismissal. They were too preoccupied with their theological arguments or too trusting of their master, who remained profoundly still, unaffected by the gathering gloom. The transition from calm twilight to ominous threat accelerated with frightening speed, catching even Eleazar off guard. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees in moments, and a strange, mournful moan began to whistle down the ravines that bordered the eastern shore, growing rapidly into a sustained shriek. The blackness Eleazar had noted was now engulfing the sky, blotting out the last vestiges of daylight, giving the water an unsettling, metallic sheen. The first true gust hit the boat like a blacksmith's hammer. It wasn't the steady wind a sailor learns to manage. It was a violent, chaotic strike that spun the tiller out of Eleazar's grasp and threw water high over the gunwales. Panic immediately erupted among the passengers. The disciples, many of them experienced fishermen like Peter and Andrew, knew the unique terror of a Kinneret squall. They scrambled to secure the sail, now violently flapping and threatening to tear the mast from its socket. Eleazar yelled instructions, his voice swallowed instantly by the roaring wind, forcing him to rely on desperate hand gestures. He fought the tiller, attempting to keep the bow pointed into the rapidly building waves, monstrous green hells that rose faster than any natural swell he had ever witnessed. The boat was small, low-slung, and quickly taking on water. Buckets were deployed, but they were useless against the deluge pouring over the sides. The storm had come with such ferocious suddenness that they were now entirely at its mercy, caught in the middle of the deepest part of the lake, far from the relative safety of the shore. Eleazar's seasoned terror was compounded by the fact that this particular squall felt personal, malevolent. It wasn't just a weather pattern. It felt like the physical manifestation of the chaos that had already consumed his inner life. He tasted the salt spray, mixed with the sweat of sheer exertion, and felt the chilling reality of his situation. They were likely going to sink. A wave, larger and more brutal than the rest, crashed directly over the stern, filling the bottom of the boat with freezing water, lifting the small vessel high into the air and then slamming it back down with a sickening crack. The fight for survival became a desperate, primal struggle against the elemental fury of nature. Eleazar was no longer thinking of his debt or his shame. He was operating purely on the muscle memory of the sea. He fought the tiller with every ounce of strength, his muscles screaming against the sudden, savage shifts in the water, trying to prevent the boat from broaching, turning sideways to the waves which would guarantee capsizing. The noise was deafening. The howling wind, the relentless drumming of rain, the creaking wood of the straining vessel, and the terrified cries of the passengers. Even the most hardened fishermen among the disciples were shouting in fear, their faces pale and slick with spray. Peter, usually a rock, was frantically bailing water, his eyes wide and panicked, shouting commands that no one could hear over the din. Eleazar watched the level of the water inside the hull steadily rise. The boat was heavy, sluggish, and dangerously low in the water. Every time they crested a wave, the trough felt like a final plunge into oblivion. Eleazar saw their mortality reflected in the wild, churning surface of the lake. He knew the statistics of these squalls. Many boats were claimed by the Kinneret every year, sometimes taking entire families down without a trace. The sheer physical exhaustion began to set in. His arms felt like lead, his lungs burned from the cold air and the effort of bracing himself against the continuous, violent lurching. He realized with a terrifying clarity that they were losing the battle. The boat was simply too small, the storm too powerful, and the waves too steep. He heard the sickening sound of wood splintering near the bow, confirming his worst fears. The vessel was beginning to give way under the immense pressure. In this moment of utter defeat, when rationality dictated that he should redouble his efforts, Eleazar felt a profound sense of surrender wash over him. His grip on the tiller loosened momentarily. He thought perhaps he would just let go. He had fought the battles of his life, both large and small, with vigor, only to end up here, sinking, lost, and ruined. If the God of Abraham was merciful, maybe he would allow this watery grave to finally provide the peace his waking life denied him. He looked toward the stern, partly to check the integrity of the rear planking, but mostly to seek some confirmation of the universal terror they were all experiencing, a shared acknowledgement of their imminent doom. It was then, in the eye of the physical tempest, that Eleazar's world tilted completely. He saw him. Amidst the chaos of splintering wood, crashing water, and desperate men, the teacher remained perfectly, impossibly still. Jesus was deep asleep in the stern, using the worn leather cushion. The waves were washing over the sides mere inches from his head. The spray was drenching his garments. The entire boat was being tossed violently. Yet his breathing remained slow, even, and deep. He was not merely resting. He was profoundly at peace. This sight was more shocking, more destabilizing than the storm itself. It did not inspire calm in Eleazar. It ignited a fierce, burning indignation. How could this man, who preached of eternal life and bore the hopes of hundreds, display such indifference? Was he simply exhausted, or was this a calculated display of detachment? Eleazar, whose very soul was screaming in existential terror, whose physical body was on the verge of collapsing from strain, could not comprehend this radical stillness. It felt like an insult to the suffering. The disciples, having reached their breaking point, stumbled toward the stern, their voices ragged with panic and accusation. "Master, do you not care that we are perishing?" Peter's voice was high and broken, stripped of all bravado. They physically shook him awake, their desperation palpable. Eleazar watched Jesus slowly stir, as if waking from a pleasant midday nap in a quiet courtyard. He did not immediately leap to the pumps or grab a rope. He simply sat up, taking in the scene, the mountainous waves, the howling wind, the sheer terror etched onto the faces of his followers with an expression of measured, gentle concern, completely devoid of panic. This absolute absence of fear was what terrified Eleazar most. He had expected the great teacher to be afraid, to join in the struggle, or at least to show concern for his life. Instead, he radiated a centeredness that seemed to defy the physical laws of the universe. Eleazar realized that the central conflict was not the boat versus the storm. It was the human spirit overwhelmed by chaos versus a spirit anchored so deeply that external turbulence was irrelevant. It was the moment where Eleazar understood that the secret to peace might not be the elimination of the struggle, but the discovery of an inner shelter strong enough to withstand it. But where was that shelter found? In the middle of your own life's most terrifying storm, when the pressure feels absolute and the end seems certain, where do you turn for that unshakable anchor? Do you desperately fight the waves, hoping your strength will hold out? Or do you search for a peace that transcends your circumstances? Take a moment and share in the comments. What is the most chaotic period you have ever navigated? And did you find that inner peace, or did you only rely on brute force and willpower to survive it? The teacher's response was not a shout over the wind, but a quiet, almost dismissive question directed at his panic-stricken followers. "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" The words were spoken without malice, but with a profound, almost heartbreaking disappointment. Eleazar, shivering and exhausted at the tiller, heard the question and realized it was aimed not at their seamanship, but at the condition of their souls. They were afraid because they had put their faith entirely in the stability of the wood and the clemency of the weather, things that fail, rather than in the power of the one who was accompanying them. Then Jesus stood. It was an astonishing act of stability in a boat that was listing and rocking violently. He raised his hand, not dramatically, but deliberately, and spoke. He did not pray, nor did he negotiate with the elements. He commanded them, "Peace, be still." He addressed the furious elements as if chastising an unruly child. His voice was calm, clear, and utterly authoritative, yet barely louder than the storm's continuous roar. Eleazar braced himself for the next wave, expecting the wind to rip the sound away, but something utterly impossible happened instead. It was not a gradual cessation, not a slow dying down of the wind that would allow the waves time to settle. The change was instantaneous and total. The howling, tearing wind stopped dead. The rain instantly ceased. The mountainous waves that had threatened to swamp them flattened immediately, leaving the surface of the lake smooth and placid, marred only by the boat's rocking in the residual swell. The transition from apocalyptic chaos to absolute stillness took less than a breath. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a vast, profound vacuum, terrifying in its completeness. The dripping water from the oars and the gasping breaths of the men were the loudest noises in the universe. The disciples stood frozen, soaking wet, staring at the glassy surface of the lake and then back at the man who had just commanded the physical laws of nature to rewrite themselves for his convenience. Eleazar felt the tiller settle immediately, finding no resistance from the water, and he realized his hands were still gripping wood that was no longer needed for control. The fear that had gripped him during the storm was replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread, not of the sea, but of the man who had just demonstrated power over everything, including the very despair that had consumed Eleazar. The silence stretched, heavier than the roar of the squall had ever been. Eleazar slowly straightened up from his crouched position, his limbs stiff and shaking, staring dumbly at the water. The clouds, moments ago a terrifying black ceiling, had begun to dissipate rapidly, revealing the vast, star-dusted velvet of the night sky above. The remnants of the storm were just damp wood, shocked men, and the lingering, acrid scent of ozone. The disciples exchanged looks of profound astonishment and terror, muttering quietly, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Eleazar did not join their bewildered discussion. He was too busy piecing his shattered reality back together. He had witnessed thousands of storms, understood the predictable logic of the sea, and knew that the elements did not yield to human will. Yet, they had yielded. The miracle was not the physical calming of the waves, but the immediate, unquestioning obedience of raw, untamed nature. This realization forced Eleazar to confront a truth more frightening than the prospect of death, that the existential dread that defined his life might be unnecessary, rooted in a false premise. If a single man could wield such effortless authority over the external world, what did that say about the internal chaos Eleazar had been drowning in? He suddenly saw his own despair for what it was, a boat dangerously taking on water, driven by the winds of shame and debt, but ultimately controlled by his own choice of anchorage. He realized that the teacher had not been asleep out of carelessness, but out of absolute, unshakable trust. Jesus' peace was not the absence of trouble, but the presence of something stronger than trouble. Eleazar's entire life philosophy, which centered on the brutal, deterministic fight against inevitable loss, crumbled into dust. He had been so focused on managing the symptoms of his failure, the nets, the loan, the gossip, that he had ignored the source of true peace that was literally sleeping right behind him. The shame of welcoming death earlier in the storm returned to him with bitter force. He had been ready to surrender to the temporary physical chaos, never realizing that the master of all creation was within arm's reach, offering an eternal, unshakable sanctuary. The rest of the short journey was completed in an almost eerie quietude. The oars dipped gently into the now calm water, the only sounds the soft, rhythmic splash and the low murmur of the disciples trying to process the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Eleazar sat at the tiller, maintaining his course, but his attention was entirely focused on the teacher, who now sat calmly in the stern, his gaze distant, seemingly unaware of the profound scrutiny he was under. Eleazar felt a desperate need to understand, not the mechanics of the miracle, he knew that was beyond his comprehension, but the source of the peace that allowed a man to sleep through a gale and command the sky to silence. As they neared the eastern shore, a lonely, undeveloped stretch of beach, Eleazar knew he couldn't simply disembark and return to his old life. The storm had broken something in him, and the subsequent peace had revealed the cracks in his foundation. He waited until the boat grated gently onto the sand, the disciples moving quickly to follow the teacher ashore, eager to see what lay ahead. Eleazar remained seated, clutching the tiller, refusing to move. Jesus, sensing the gravity of the man's silence, paused on the sand and looked back at Eleazar. Their eyes met across the wet hull. Jesus did not smile, nor did he rush. He waited, granting Eleazar the space and time he needed. Finally, the fisherman slowly climbed out, his legs wobbly, and approached the teacher, stopping several paces away, unable to look him directly in the face. The exhaustion was physical, but the confession needed to be spiritual. Eleazar confessed not the fear of the storm, but the secret terrible wish for oblivion. He spoke of the loan shark, the ruined nets, the shame, and the deep, pervasive feeling that he was a disappointment to his lineage and his God. "I fought the waves, Rabbi," Eleazar whispered, his voice hoarse. "But when the boat was sinking, a part of me welcomed the water. I wanted the chaos to consume me because it felt like the only escape from the chaos I created inside myself." He looked up, shame burning his face. Jesus listened patiently, his expression one of infinite compassion, a sharp contrast to the judgmental faces Eleazar usually encountered in his daily life. When Eleazar finished his broken confession, citing his financial ruin and the crushing weight of public shame as the anchors dragging him down, Jesus spoke. He did not offer easy solutions or promise immediate material wealth. Instead, he addressed the core issue, the misplaced burden. "Eleazar," the teacher said gently, walking closer until he stood right beside the fisherman, looking out at the calm, silvered water. "You carried the weight of the sea and the sky upon your shoulders, believing that if you fought hard enough, you could control them, or at least survive them. But the weight that truly sank you was the burden of believing you had to earn your own peace. You sought rest in oblivion because you thought the price of life was unbearable." Jesus turned to face him fully. "Do you not see? The storm demanded your attention, your fear, and your labor. It sought to drown you. But the peace I offer asks only for trust, for the surrender of that burden. Your shame and your debt are heavy, yes, but they are not ultimate realities. They are shadows cast by the sun, and you confuse the shadow for the sun itself. The peace I demonstrate is not achieved by eliminating the chaos of the world. The debts remain, the storms will surely return, but by changing the foundation upon which you stand. If your anchor is trust in the Father, then the rocking of the boat becomes merely a momentary inconvenience, not a sentence of death. I slept because I knew my life was not dependent upon the clemency of the wind or the strength of the wood, but upon the one who created them. That same eternal certainty is available to you, Eleazar, if you are willing to lay down the fight against yourself and simply accept the gift of rest. Eleazar felt a shift within him, a release of tension he hadn't known he held. It wasn't a miracle of fortune, but a miracle of perspective. He was not cured of his problems, but he was cured of his need to carry them alone. He saw that true peace was not the absence of external trouble, but the realization of an internal divine presence that rendered the trouble powerless. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the sky with quiet, resolute colors, Eleazar returned to the boat. The others had gone, walking inland to the next town, eager to continue their ministry. Eleazar was alone, inspecting the minor damage the boat had sustained and preparing for the return journey. He noticed the faint high water mark where the waves had nearly swamped the vessel. He touched the leather cushion in the stern, now slightly damp, the cushion that had served as the pillow for the master of the universe. He smiled, a genuine, unforced expression that felt unfamiliar on his weary face. The physical challenges of his life remained. The journey back would be long. The debts still loomed large, and his reputation in Capernaum was still tarnished. But everything was different, because Eleazar was different. He knew that the most dangerous chaos he faced was the one he nurtured in his own heart, the chaos of self-reliance divorced from faith. He pushed the boat off the sand and began to row westward. The sea was calm, but now, even if a storm were to rise instantly, Eleazar knew he would face it not with despair, but with a centeredness rooted in that terrifying, absolute stillness he had witnessed. He no longer sought escape, he sought anchorage. He understood that Jesus' secret to peace was recognizing that when you invite the eternal into your fleeting existence, the temporary troubles of this world lose their power to define your outcome. The storm had revealed Eleazar's ultimate fragility. The subsequent peace revealed his ultimate potential. He rowed toward the rising sun, the familiar scent of salt and fish now carrying a new, profound meaning of hope. If this story of finding ultimate calm in the eye of life's deepest storms touched your heart and helped you realize that the chaos you face does not have the final say, please subscribe to Shoreline Parables. We share these ancient New Testament stories, stories of Jesus' wisdom and compassion every week to help you find that same unshakable peace, meaning, and healing in your own journey.